Well, first and foremost, it has to be said and known that I mean house music started as something for the LGBTQ community, um, by by Black people, brown people in the U.S. That's what this music came from. It came from underground dance music, and for people that wanted to continue dancing to by proxy, I'll connect the dots here, but to disco.
Mm.
And there was a famous kind of thinly veiled, let's just call it a hate rally in Chicago, where there was this Chicago rock DJ that did this campaign called Disco Sucks. And it was basically kind of a smear campaign against disco and also by proxy the gay community. And they told people to bring all these old disco records down to Comiskey Park to this baseball field, and it was like a disco demolition. They were going to blow up these disco records. Okay. And funnily enough, that also backfired because they blew up these records and also just cratered the field and like ruined the sports field as well. So it came back to bite them. But I mean, that's the kind of level of hate that was, around even in those times for the LGBTQ community in the United States. And, you imagine, that would be a terrible thing to witness happening around you, if you were from that community and you also liked going out dancing with your friends, that's to see your music destroyed by dynamite on a televised event. That's pretty ominous and dark. And that's something that happened. And there was definitely a backlash against that. When I say that, I mean like a resurgence of, okay, well, we're going to take this underground. Like if there's that sentiment, there's this house music community. And there were these clubs that were gay clubs that were Black and brown people, LGBTQ community, that built this, from the ground up, brick by brick. And so people had a safe haven there. And then it was like, okay, well, what if we take this disco record? What if I now I've got a drum machine in the DJ booth, people have like a reel to reel tape player. They're doing edits. They're making edits of the tracks to extend them for dancers. And then they want to add the drum loops. And then it was like, oh, let's just put a 909 kick over this disco beat. And then it's house music. And then people are just like, okay, well, what if I just have a 909 beat and that's the track? Or there's like one synth or there's one vocal. And these raw kind of jack tracks. And there's like the classic, some tracks were like the Jesse Saunders, like On and On, which is by some considered to be like the first house track of all time. There's early ones like Chippy's, like Time to Jack, some just raw like call to action dance tracks, things like that were going on. But yeah, it was a lot of like underground experimentation in dance culture, keeping dance clubs alive. Disco became a super commercial mainstream thing, and this was a more raw, emotional, community-driven effort. So that was happening in Chicago, and this was well before my time. This was the '80s, and people were making songs. It was like Frankie Knuckles, and Jamie Principle, and they're making like songs, but they saw as even like pop songs, but it was like coming from this house perspective. And I mean, as many know, the story has been published worldwide, but I mean, it was like house music comes from the shortening of the club called the Warehouse in Chicago. So people would go to the record store, they're like, oh yeah, I heard this song last night, it was amazing. I don't know, it had some vocal in it, and the guy's like, the record store person might be like, what is it? Oh, it's the Warehouse. Oh, it's like, oh, you want that house music, So then there was like a house music section of the record store where people could go to buy the records that were being played at these clubs. These were in these dedicated underground DJ driven record stores. So that's kind of how the house music label even began, was because of this club, the Warehouse. So there was that, and that was the community spirit in Chicago from those early days. And I wasn't there for those times, but I do my due diligence to know where this came from, and anybody who's into this music should do the same. so that happened. I mean, the Detroit thing, you know, again, I wasn't there in Detroit as all this happened, but from accounts, I mean, it was something. It also a matter of like these guys in Detroit were going to Chicago and listening to the music, freaking out at the clubs, and going back to Detroit and making music. And so there was this connection between the scenes. But Detroit, again, because of this potpourri radio influences, like the electrifying mojo, there was all, and the whole industrial aspect of the city of Detroit. It was a manufacturing city for cars, and then these factories were sometimes left, you know, abandoned. People had lost their jobs and were losing hope. People were looking for a way out to kind of escape through music. And there was this kind of machine funk that seeped into it from the production line of automobiles, and the sense of kind of techno future visions of what had happened in the past, what might be possible in the future, and different aspects of music that were influencing people in Detroit. So, but the scene there also, there was a lot of these parties that were like social clubs, kind of, where it would be like high school dance, like a private kind of high school party and things like this, where DJs would play there, and they were like DJ crews. This was part of what was happening in Detroit as techno, what it was pre-techno was in its genesis. And then there was this club, the Music Institute, that only operated for a short time, but that was like legendary in terms of its influence, you know, and it was predominantly, it was a Black club, and you know, there were barely any white people going to this club.
Yep.
It was like D. Wynn and Derek May on the decks, and other guests, and it would just be like one strobe light and just, you know, techno, whatever was coming in, whatever people were making in Detroit at the time, and then would get played there and immediately, and it was this like flashpoint of generation of this music. I mean, like one of the white people that went to this club was a young Richie Houghton, and it blew his mind. And you know, he's talked about this many times, that like that was just like, what is this? You know, that completely lit a fire under him to go on to do all these things that he did. So, for example, so there was that, and then I mean, in Berlin, it was more of an example of. In the U.S., it was kind of some societal influences that had kind of pushed people artistically into these paths. And in Berlin, it was also this kind of cataclysmic event of the wall coming down, and there being this whole, literally like a whole new world opening up to people from two different sides, and this exchange of ideas and this mutual hunger for freedom and understanding the others who were, you know, grown up socially in a totally different mentality. That happened then at the same time while these events were happening, and dance music was blowing up. It was kind of at the same time, Trésor, there was this new news conference in New York, and people from Trésor were there, and they ended up signing this X101, this like massive, you know, track for Trésor, that blew up as this kind of a sonic weapon of sorts that totally set off the Berlin scene. I mean, all these things in Berlin were happening where it was an exchange of ideas, and there was a space to have events in the former East where people there were all these vacant buildings. People didn't even know who owned them anymore because the infrastructure had collapsed.
Yep.
And so people could go in there and throw parties. And then there was techno coming in, and there was underground resistance was kind of being brought over to Berlin by Trésor, and that was just one slice of the puzzle there. And that music coming out of Berlin in itself, and there was even kind of popular dance music. There was also like these radio shows from Marusha, and then again, not unlike Chicago or Detroit, there was radio had an influence, and then there was underground stuff happening, and this explosion of being commercially accessible, and then also underground things being discovered and bubbling up, and then people coming together and just ready to go for it, led to this explosion of freedom that embodies the spirit of Berlin dance music today. And I think, you know, it was certainly a welcome place for people of all backgrounds. to an extent, but also, I mean, it was raw people dancing on concrete, dirty basement floors, raving. You know, one difference that I like to point out is I feel like the Berlin explosion of dance music was not as much based on dancing, because in the US these were happening at underground clubs. In the Loft there was, like, you know, Mancuso had the Loft in New York, and there was actually dance songs played from beginning to end on a hi-fi sound system, dancers dancing from beginning to end of a song. The song would stop, people would applaud, other dancers would come forward, the next song would come on. It was a real dance ritual, and there was a wooden floor. Get on the floor and do movements and get into dancing. And whether you were, you know, getting into early break dancing, you were a tap dancer, salsa, jazz, you were becoming what was then to become house dancer. That was all part of the ritual. Whereas, as it seems to me, and also reading books, which I like, a book that I'd recommend, like the Klang der Familie, it's about the history of techno in Berlin. That really lays out a lot of what happened in Berlin for anybody who's curious to learn more from the people that were there. But, you know, people were climbing into some concrete basement with a strobe light and just raving. You know, there wasn't a club, there wasn't a wooden dance floor
of course,
to dance music on. So I really feel like people came at it more from a hedonistic, freedom, open-minded expression than like a dance ritual in Berlin. But yeah, and certainly now, like, Berlin is a haven for LGBTQ communities, and that's really important. And I think it's interesting that I mean, in Berlin, and I've been here for a while now, that's just such a part of the tapestry of dance music culture here, and it's just what one understands as this is just how it is. Whereas in many parts of the world, it has been proliferated all over the world in terms of dance music, but the LGBTQ community and communities of color are not represented there that much, if at all. And that needs to change. And I mean, people need to know the history of this music from its inception and understand that it's a music that's always been about freedom, and with that freedom comes inclusion and tolerance and understanding and love. And that's what it's about. So Berlin, it's easy to look around and be like, oh yeah, this is pretty inclusive. But yeah, there's plenty of other places where it's not as inclusive.